Hello, everybody. My name is Alexandra Vacru. I'm the Executive Director of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. And it's a great pleasure for me today to be chairing a talk with Maxim Shrayer. Maxim is a professor of Russian, English, and Jewish Studies at Boston College, and also director of the Project on Russian and Eurasian Jewry at the Davis Center. He was born in Moscow into a writer's family in 1967 and emigrated to the US 20 years later. He's the author and editor of over 15 books, including Leaving Russia, A Jewish Story, Yom Kippur in Amsterdam, and Voices of Russian Jewish Literature. Shrayer is a Guggenheim Fellow and the winner of a National Jewish Book Award. And his latest book, from which he'll read today, is A Russian Immigrant, 3 Novellas. This talk has been made possible through the generous support of the Genesis Philanthropy, and I am very happy to turn it over to Maxim.
Thank you, Alexandra. Thanks so much for your introduction. It's very good to see you, and good afternoon to all our friends. I just want to thank again Genesis, of course, and our other co-sponsors, but particularly all the colleagues of the Davis Center who are working miraculously through all this. And we're live. We are able to have our events virtually, which is really exciting. And I'm just going to share the screen and quickly explain how I envision this. I envision this as a conversation, and I want to do at least 3 things. I want to talk a little bit about translingual writing and some Russian and Jewish connections. And then I want to talk about A Russian Immigrant, my book, and the larger project that it represents. And if there's time, to talk a little bit about some more recent material, which is literary responses to COVID-19. And then, of course, I'm really looking forward to your comments and questions. So I want to begin by telling you a little bit about the time when I was born as an immigrant, and I suppose as a translingual. And that was in the summer of 1987. So my family, my parents and I had just left the Soviet Union. We were in transit in Italy, waiting for our refugee visas to come to America. And at the time, the black sand of a seedy Tyrrhenian public beach in the Italian town of Ladispoli was my open air reading room. We had lived through almost 9 years of refuseniks limbo. We were in Italy. And it was very much a summer of transit, a summer of discoveries. And so one of the things I did very actively that summer is I pored over books by Russian exiles, because I was very, very interested in what it meant to write in exile and to be a Russian cultural figure in exile. Russian exiles who had faced the predicament of choosing another language of self-expression. Not surprisingly, first on my list was Vladimir Nabokov, who would become one of the protagonists of my work, the great Russian-American writer, author of Lolita and Pnin, who, of course, remade himself after coming to America as a refugee in 1940, having rescued his Jewish wife and son. Now, I also, and I think, Alexander, you will enjoy hearing this, I also enjoyed books by Elsa Triolet, who had started in the 1920s as an émigré, writing in Russian, but quickly transitioned to French while remaining one of France's leading champions of Russian and Soviet letters. Finally, I was also reading the novels and stories of Mark Aldanov. Why Aldanov? Well, first of all, Aldanov wrote in Russian, but actively published in English. And in fact, what is largely forgotten is that in the 1940s and early 50s, Aldanov was probably the most commercially successful Russian writer in translation in the United States. And that was very interesting to me again. So it was very much before the Lolita explosion. With me in a small leather-bound notebook was 2/3 of what would become my first poetry collection, which would be published in New York in 1990. And so what was going through my head? Would I ever be able to write in another language? I wondered that summer. What would be the price of losing, or perhaps of abnegating, what I thought at the time to be my Russian voice. And then fast forward, and we're now already in Providence, Rhode Island. 5 months later, it's a wet November afternoon. I'm walking across the campus of Bryant University, where I am now a transfer student, a junior, repeating my third university year again. And I'm knocking somewhat timidly on the door of John Hawkes, often known as Jack Hawkes. Who was Jack Hawkes? He was a legendary American postmodernist, the most famous writer on the Brown faculty, and Brown had a very, very well-known writing program. It also included, for instance, Edwin Honig, who was a major American poet and a translator from Spanish and Portuguese, Robert Coover. But I wanted to see Hawkes. He was retiring that year, and I desperately wanted to get into his last fiction writing seminar without really having the credentials for that, mind you. Hawkes was silver-haired, witty, verbally perverse. He sort of listened to my rambling account of leaving Moscow, of writing poetry and fiction in Russian, and coming to the US. He waited silently, lips twitching, and then asked a little nervously, "Have you read Nabokov?" He pronounced Nabokov in a very kind of Anglo-Saxon way, with the second O particularly rounded, like Nabokov. "Have you read Nabokov?" he said. And I was like, "Nabokov, of course. He's remarkable," said Hawkes. Now, what's important is in 1965, his novel Second Skin competed with Nabokov's The Defense, Защита Luzhina, The Defense, and with Bashevis Singer's short Friday for the National Book Award for Fiction. And actually, Saul Bellows' Herzog ended up taking the prize. What I immediately recognized, and this has to do also with the fact that I was coming from the Soviet Union, it was still very much the Soviet Union. And of course, politics and ideology was very much on my mind, especially given what my parents and I had just gone through. Hawkes had absolutely no interest in Soviet politics. He also had no ear for Jewish immigrant anxieties. Yet something intrigued him about the idea of this 20-year-old Jewish Russian man who is thinking of writing in another language. So he let me into his fiction seminar, and it was in the spring of 1988, a translingual novice surrounded by other young writers, all of them American-born. It was then that I tried my hand at composing in English. And of course, I'm happy to tell that I did not compose in English. I wrote in Russian, and then I translated it as well as I could and presented as basically my work. Many years have gone by. I have now lived in Boston much longer than in my native Moscow. It's true. I've lived in Boston longer than any place in my life. I've gone through periods of writing actively in Russian, but also of going for months without composing a line in Russian and writing only in English. More recently, I would say the past 4 years, I've been writing and publishing in both languages on a regular basis, and also co-translating my own work from English into Russian. And I want to say that many times, really many times over these years, I've asked myself, sometimes happily, sometimes wistfully, what it means to write and I guess to live translingually. What I've learned is that there's more to translingualism than working not just in one language, but in two or perhaps more than two, simultaneously or consecutively. In the not so recent past, translingual writers used to be really all alone, artistically homeless, culturally stateless. And I will give a few examples. Think, for instance, of the loneliness of Rahel, arguably the first modern Hebrew woman poet, who was born in 1890 on the Volga and died in Tel Aviv in 1931, who is, of course, remembered by her published collections of Hebrew verse, but many people don't realize that she left an unpublished volume of Russian poems. Think of Paul Celan, a multilingual Jew from northern Bukovina, who lost his family during the Shoah, who went on to write and publish peerless German language poetry, and who in 1970 killed himself in Paris. And then think finally perhaps of the less unhappy story of Samuel Beckett, the Irish literary genius who spent most of his adult life in France and who translated most of his French works into English. So the question I have is a translingual writer who has found a new home no longer writing in trance, no longer living in transit? So in that sense, perhaps literary translingualism means, as the very passionately monolingual American poet Robert Frost, whom I greatly admire, put it, betwixt and between. This is from his poem, Peril of Hope. It's right in there, betwixt and between the orchard bare and the orchard green, which, by the way, is, I think, very resonant because it is about this moment when you think that it's spring, but it's actually something else, and death is somehow in the air. But Frost was really, truly a kind of great monolingual genius. I don't think translingualism was, the kind of category that he thought about. So what happens when translinguals discover a literary community? What changes when we perceive ourselves and are perceived as a trend, as a literary movement or a school? So I'd like to turn very briefly to the story that I know best and sometimes call my own, which is that of ex-Russians and ex-Soviets writing in English. Now, take this kind of very early example. It's the example of the Russian diplomat Pavel Svinyin, who is known in English as Svenin, who lived and published in Philadelphia in the 18 teens, both in Russian and in English. He was, of course, entirely in a league of his own. Now, when the Yiddish and Russian-speaking Abraham Kahan, the legendary editor of The Forward, an immigrant from the Russian Empire, was learning to write fiction in English in the 1900s, of course, he too had few interlocutors, few colleagues. And even when the Petersburg-born Vladimir Nabokov, whom I already mentioned, came to America, he really had very few colleagues in the true sense of this word, very few translingual colleagues. I think the story changes and expands in the 1970s and 1980s. This was when many writers came to the US and Canada from the former USSR, riding the wave of the Great Jewish Emigration. These new Russian-American writers, Joseph Brodsky most famously, sought to write in English Russianly, and not so infrequently, this ambition stood in the way of their styles and voices as they forded the Hudson and the St. Lawrence. I think it's taken at least a generation for Soviet immigrants to find their literary bearings in the New World, and perhaps even longer to find a translingual neighborhood, a community, both in their own eyes and in the eyes of the American and Canadian cultural mainstream. Some of today's translinguals left the former Soviet Union as children and young people, and this is a growing list. So I am just gonna drop a few names. It's a much greater, much broader, larger list. But of course, David Bezmozgis, Anya Ulinich, Boris Fishman, Lara Vapnyar, Sana Krasikov, and many others. It's truly a growing community. What I find interesting is that they, or I suppose we, have our literary great uncles and great aunts on both sides of the Atlantic. Representatives of this so-called new wave of American and Canadian translingualism write in English, but do so by hearkening back to such major Jewish Russian authors as, for instance, the incomparable Isaac Babel, or to Ilya Ilf and Evgeny Petrov, who co-authored the famous satirical novels in the early Soviet years. At the same time, and I think it's hardly surprising, these young Russian-American authors also nominate Bernard Malamud, Philip Roth, and in the Canadian case, Mordecai Richler as their literary ancestors. Today's Russian-American writers have translingual literary lovers and partners, friends and next door neighbors. So I very much think it's a growing texture of a literary community. and a greater sense of shared cultural ancestry and thematic unity makes it more of a kind of Russophone family business, I suppose, and also something of a Jewish community affair. And of course, it's too early. One of my teachers, the late Victor Terrace, used to say that as a literary scholar, he doesn't write about anything that's, doesn't have the vintage of 40, 50 years. As a critic, you can speculate. So I guess here I'm speculating as a critic. And in doing so, I think only time will show whether translingual authors who form a literary community are bound to lose their unique translingual voice. So I want to circle back to my 1970 experience as a Soviet refugee in Italy. This experience eventually informed the writing of my book, Waiting for America, A Story of Emigration, in which discoveries of new worlds and also of new words are measured on the broken scale of nostalgia. Other books of literary nonfiction and fiction have followed. Today, I'd like to talk a little bit about this project, which was originally a Russian immigrant, 3 novellas, but over the past 4 months, particularly during the months of isolation and the COVID pandemic, it's sort of grown into a larger literary project. So if I may, I just want to talk a little bit about this book, how it began, and what I think is at stake here in terms of some of the questions that I just laid out. I think there's something funny going on. Okay. Yes, I think we're good. Are we still sharing the screen? Alexandra, can you see the screen? Oh, good. Yes. So in terms of how large the community is, they say that there are perhaps as many as 1 million Russian Americans. The majority of us came here on the wings of the Great Jewish Emigration, no longer at home in Russia, but not quite assimilated into the American mainstream. The daily lives of Russian immigrants are fueled by a combustible mix of success and alienation. And so when I was working on these 3 interconnected novellas, I had this idea in mind that the protagonist, whose name is Simon Reznikov, he used to be Simeon Syoma, but when he came to America, the name was changed to Simon for reasons that are not very difficult to figure out if you try to transliterate the name Simeon. He is also Boston-based, but unlike his creator, he is still restless. And he's so restless that unresolved feelings about his Jewish and American present and his Russian and Soviet past prevent him from easily putting down roots in his new country. And one of the ways that I communicate this restlessness is by telling his story both linearly and non-linearly, with elements of suspense, mystery, and even crime, including murder, which was the first time I ever wrote murder, honestly, in any of my work. Don't know what came over me. I'd like to offer a short passage that I will read, but if I may, I just want to make 2 more quick observations. One has to do with the idea of the baggage that immigrants bring with them. And I think this baggage can be largely categorized as consisting of 2 parts. One is, of course, material baggage. For instance, in the case of my family, we came here with 4 suitcases and 2 typewriters, my father's and my own. That was the material baggage, right? And then there is, of course, the baggage of memory. My sense is that assimilation and acculturation after the American fashion still amounts to an accumulation of new material baggage, but also the gradual disposal of the baggage of memory. So in that sense, I think what goes on in this story, but in other stories by Russian immigrants writing in English, is that there is a kind of gradual acquisition of Americanness and this very partial and painful, I suppose, expenditure of Russian and Soviet memories. I just want to share, I guess, one anecdote which has to do with how the cover was chosen. This is also important for something I hope to address toward the very end of this talk. So I was, and I am still, living in Brookline, very close to a neighborhood park called Griggs Park. This was 2 years ago in the fall. And I came out one morning to discover that all the weeping willows that surround the park had dropped their leaves almost overnight. And there was this space of these silverish lancet-shaped leaves. And somehow it struck me as particularly fitting. But what you cannot see in this image is that across the little path, there was a bench. And sitting on this bench was a man about my age with a very old dog in Newfoundland. The dog was so old that it barely moved. And I remember thinking to myself, he's an immigrant. He came with his dog when it was a puppy, and the dog has aged, but he too has aged with this dog. And when the book was already in page proofs, I actually was able to insert a little bit of dialogue. This is in the middle novella called Brotherly Love, which ends with a reunion of two former lovers from the Soviet Union who have not seen each other for many, many years, and they have the whole day to catch up. And at one point they're taking a walk around this lake and they see this person that I inserted into the story. And he says to her, he looks like a Russian immigrant. And she says, no, Polish. And I don't know what came over me, but basically this sort of informed the whole making of the cover, but it continues to inform some of the things that I've been thinking about in connection with isolation, because the protagonist, whom you will meet in something I'll read, is still in this park, and the dog is even older and sicker. So in a sense, these memories continue to age, whereas in my story, they have a kind of finite vintage. Now, I would like to read a short passage, if I may, and this comes from the end of the first novella, which is called Bohemian Spring. And Bohemian Spring here is a play on two things: Bohemian as a lifestyle, but also Bohemia as the historic Czech lands. This is right after the Velvet Revolution and the Velvet Divorce. The protagonist comes to Prague because he's researching the biography of this very elusive Jewish Czech genius, of whom very little is known. And he meets a young Czech woman by the name of Milena, and they develop strong feelings for one another. And the experience of being for him, the former Soviet immigrant, the experience of being in the Czech Republic is particularly striking because he feels like he's in Slavic lands. The Soviet Union is really not that far away, but he is still at the boundaries. He's not back visiting his old home. So this is the short passage. Walking from Clementinum toward the Charles Bridge, Simon thought of how soothing it felt to be an anonymous person in the seething city crowd. His plane was leaving Saturday morning, and Friday was their last day together in Prague. His original plan had been to do some souvenir shopping and find a present for his mother, perhaps a locally made scarf or shawl, or a pair of earrings with Czech garnets. Instead, without fully knowing what he was doing, he hopped on the tram. From his stop, he ran up the hill all the way to Wittek and Irenka's house. I just need to digress and explain that he's renting a room in the house of this vintage 1968 Czech dissident who now sort of rents rooms to visiting foreigners. He borrowed Wittek's portable console. It's laden body reminding him of his own father's old typewriter. Kneeling in front of the only chair in his room, Simon machine-gunned the text of an invitation. Simon Reznikov, 516 Whitney Avenue, apartment 2, New Haven, Connecticut. The U.S. Consulate, Prague, the Czech Republic. It is my pleasure to invite Ms. Milena Krupichkova, citizen of Czechoslovakia, to visit me in the United States of America during June-August 1993. Ms. Krupichkova is a close friend of mine, and the purpose of her visit will be tourism. Throughout the duration of Ms. Krupichkova's stay in the United States, I will take care of her accommodations and, if necessary, provide her with financial and healthcare assistance. I am a U.S. citizen and would be grateful if the U.S. Consulate acted favorably and promptly on Ms. Krupichkova's request for a U.S. visa. Sincerely, Simon Reznikov. He released the guide and rotated the platen knob clockwise until most of the sheet was out of the typewriter's grip. He then proofread the invitation, rotated the knob in the opposite direction, and typed the letter R over the word Czechoslovakia, crossing it out as well as he could. He rotated the knob just a touch and typed the Czech Republic above the blacked out name of the country, which the land of his birth caressed with tanks and jackboots in 1968, just as he was learning to walk in the streets of Moscow. He smiled like a blind jazz pianist, rolled the page off the platen, folded it, and placed it in an airmail envelope. It was the only envelope he had in his room, and he wrote Milena Krupichkova, Prague, on it, thinking of the lonesome boy in Chekhov's story who inscribed the envelope with the tremulous words to grandpas at the village. Taking some money from a stash he kept in his toiletry kit, Simon headed down to the tram stop. He bought a bunch of waxy tulips from a flower girl. Should I just ask Milena to marry me? Just here on the spot, Simon thought, as he walked past the interchangeable hippies strumming their guitars on the bridge. Just take my grandmother's old ring off my pinky and give it to her. He reasoned with an imaginary double who was called Shoma. For some reason, Simon was convinced that Milena would say yes, but his Russian double, was he also sure? When Simon and Milena came out of the bar holding glasses of white wine, Simon noticed Frantik, Milena's ex-boyfriend, watching them from a bookshop across the street. By the time they had found 2 empty chairs on the sidewalk and pulled them together, the jealous musician was gone. Silently, they sipped their wine, the rims of their hands joining and coming apart like blades of grass in the wind. Breaking the silence, Simon asked, Milena, I wanted to ask you something. Ask me, Milena said, lowering her angled chin onto her left shoulder. Would you like to come and stay with me this summer? In America? Yes, in America, in New Haven to be precise. But first you would fly to New York. The Kennedy Airport, like in spy novels, Milena asked. Exactly, and then we'll drive to New Haven and I'll take you around and show you New England. We can visit my folks in Boston, see Cape Cod and the ocean. There's lots to do. Will you have time for me? Simon hesitated, then reached for his breast pocket and removed the airmail envelope he had prepared for her. I didn't have another kind, he said. This is for me? Milena asked. I've typed up an invitation. You'll need to take it to the American Embassy in Prague. By the way, this is the old location, which is no longer the location in light of the recent controversy. Just a footnote. The old embassy in Prague. Here, open it. Milena slowly read the invitation, her lips mouthing some of the words. She blushed, then composed herself and said, trying to find the right English words, Simon, you surprised me. May I please think about it? They crossed to the other side holding hands. The Vltava, swollen with the spring torrents, carried urban detritus under the arches of the bridge. There are 16 of them, Simon remembered Milena telling him the first time they walked together across the Charles Bridge. Yelping and thrashing, a Maltese was trying to rip its leash from the hands of its owner. An old lady wearing a mauve hat with flowers. Small dogs, big tempers. Simon wanted to quote one of his father's aphorisms, but hesitated. He thought of his parents in Boston, of the daily Russian phone calls, and he felt a double pang of sadness, which Russian immigrants sometimes feel when traveling in Europe. I'm going to stop here, and as you can imagine, because it's only the first novella, the story continues because Milena actually turns him down, which crushes him, but in a sense liberates him of some false illusions. With that in mind, I'd like to turn to sort of the last bit of what I have prepared, which is the most improvised part and the most open-ended part. And it has to do with what I've observed and also what I've experienced as some of the literary responses to the COVID epidemic. And I think in a tentative way, as is often the case, Russians all over the world have been ahead of the curve here, because from the earliest days, there were projects which have now become famous. For instance, this project of enacting visual masterpieces, which some very talented Russian enthusiasts championed. But specifically, there have been interesting literary responses. I want to mention one that is being curated by a literary couple from New York, Gennady and Rika Katsov. And this is an anthology called Coronaverse, Стихи коронавирусного времени, poems of the coronavirus time. And this is a kind of growing compendium of texts in Russian of writers living all over the world. Some of them are translinguals, some are entirely monolingual, but it is truly, truly international. And what's particularly charming is that in addition to the texts, poets add recorded readings of their poems. So it's very much a multimedia project. I contributed a couple of poems to it. My father, who has not been writing a lot of poetry, contributed, I think, a really, really fine poem to it. And it's in a sense a kind of map of Russian letters during this pandemic. And there are others like that, but I wanted to mention this one. And lastly, to circle back to what I said I would do at the beginning, remember I was talking about the cover for A Russian Immigrant, and this gentleman whom I kept observing in Greg's Park. So imagine he's still there, and I still don't know whether he is Russian or not, and perhaps I will never find out, except he has now entered a literary text that I composed recently. A Russian Immigrant has expanded, surprisingly for me, into a poetry project, mostly in English, but also in some cases, both in English and in Russian, of poems that I started writing back in January during the election campaign. And then when the pandemic was somehow completely taking over our lives, I refocused my attention, and this literary persona, a Russian immigrant, started writing more and more about the pandemic. And if I may, I'd like to just share one text, which I think will open the whole book, which explains various things having to do with translingualism, with immigrant writing, with writing in isolation, but also places me and my literary persona on the map of what we're all experiencing here and the world over. So this is a text that is called Prologue, A Russian Immigrant Meets His Double. I just point out that it's written in terza rima, and the reasons for that, because we all like to, I think, dance with Dante's shadow every once in a while. And I think Dante was very familiar with quarantines and isolation, especially right after leaving his native Florence and spending the rest of his life unrepentantly in Ravenna. So Prologue, A Russian Immigrant Meets His Double. We used to live on Beacon Street in Brookline. The year of the election was underway, and all the different contenders looked like caricatures of virtue and dismay, and yet I chose the ones I could contend with as long as they succeeded, come what may, in beating the Trump and rescuing our tender democracy from a looming right-wing threat. I knew our freedom needed a defender. I didn't know how this theatrical election year could be so dull. And when I felt fed up with all the rest, I usually took our silver miniature poodle for walks in a secluded old park. We'd stroll around the circle and I would doodle with words and rhymes, and later I would park them on my desktop as though silly verses could offer solace and also hit the mark of truthfulness and justice universal, or simply paint a picture of spring eternal. The vernal season wasn't far ahead. The body shunned the chill and craved the sunny, languorous days, the honey of New England. On my long walks, I would observe a skinny, bespectacled fellow with a Newfoundland, old and piebald. When the weather wasn't rainy, they occupied a bench near the sandbox where the children built their castles. The owner read, the dog lay on the ground. For weeks, I walked my poodle around the circle without ever speaking to the men who seemed withdrawn or even antisocial, who owned a dog too weak to join the clan of other dogs careening or escaping from their owners who knew not where they ran. And yet I wondered, what if this is fated? What if he's also a Russian immigrant, my own double, conjured up, created to help me shape these lines into a rent against tyranny, indifference, injustice, against cruelty, contempt, intolerance. Thus I envisaged. When he came from Russia, he brought with him a puppy, now 14. He's outlived his age and broken records, an immigrant dog the world has never seen. I thought the owner lived in Moscow or Saratov, then immigrated at the age of 37 and settled in one of Boston's near suburbs where streets and parks resound with Russian verbs. Meanwhile, the Ides of March augured disaster. The crown prince of death had crossed the Styx and from the underworld returned to spread death. Faster than doctors could invent a medical fix, the Trump was useless, Congress dragged its feet, and I forgot about politics. The living life retreated, the quarantine ruled over Boston. Zoom became our window onto the world. Imagine my esteem for frozen spinach and for canned tomato. We homeschooled the kids. My wife saved lives. I taught remotely at night. I tried to veto the hours of Netflix. Then I realized that in pandemics, arguments like mine rang hollow, appeared oversized, especially to a keening teenage mind. I tinkered with some writing, nothing lofty. I watched old Soviet movies to unwind. I read my favorite poets, Zabolotsky, Akhmatova, Sylvinsky, Pasternak. I went outside. When the New England sky bled colors of sunset, I headed for the park where the dog owners maintained the social distance, whereas the dogs refused to stay apart. My Russian immigrant double kept his old place. Beside the sandbox, now cordoned off, he sat, a pad in hand. The Newfoundland was dozing at his feet. Sure enough, his memory was filled with greener pastures. The immigrant dog was tired of life. I wondered as my restless silver poodle was pulling at her leash and urging me to make my move, to seek out my double. A gust of wind went through an old willow tree. I straightened my mask and slowly approached. Please note the haunting symmetry. 2 immigrants, 2 dogs. I finally broached the subject indirectly with a nod, excuse me, and I don't mean to encroach upon your privacy. Don't you find it odd that we've been bumping into one another without ever sharing a word of conversation? I was wondering where in Russia you come from. My good double looked askance at me, then turned his gaze in the direction of sunset and replied, his Slavic accent not very strong yet tangible. My old home has been renamed, or unrenamed to be exact. St. Petersburg, I guessed. St. Isaac's Dome, yes, he confirmed, and countless other beauties. I love your dog, I interjected. He's so calm. He's dying, said my Russian immigrant double. I'm so sorry, no need. Now death's at everyone's door. I guess you're right. I heard you dabble in poesy. I chose to ignore his tone. I was interested in the substance of what he meant. Yes, more or less. Now more in English than in Russian. Ha! Another instance of trying to outdo Nabokov at his game, my double asked. No, a survival instinct. My audience is here, I came back. Your audience? My double turned my statement into a question. I was losing track of our coded exchange. A stalemate, I said, preparing to leave the park. Wait, please disregard my sarcasm, the Russian immigrant said. My mood is dark. My mother is 85. My dog is dying and lonely. I sit in this old park and think about the virus. Yes, times are trying. We all do what we can. I said, no, wait, my double asked, his voice defying the rules of distancing. Can you create a living record? I'm not sure what you mean. Can you describe this? This? You mean the taste of spring on our lips, the April wind? No, the pandemic. My double spoke with passion. The way we immigrants endure every kind of destiny's tricks, but this is too sudden. He turned his gaze downward, where in the sand the local children used to play. This is too sodden with death. Forgive the unintended pun. I think I can. Been writing in a trance. Don't stop, intoned my Russian immigrant. A mask slipped down and revealed his countenance, a faint smile like a squirrel's frenzied dance. And so with this, I leave you, I don't leave you, but I leave you to the conversation part of this program with the idea that, of course, this pandemic, I think, has made some of us immigrant writers particularly attuned to living sort of on the razor's blade of history and on the razor's blade of language. And thank you. I'm really looking forward to questions and comments.
We've got some good questions now. Let me give you the first one. It's actually the second one, but it fits in nicely with where you left things off.
Thank you.
The pandemic has us socially isolated, but virtual connection allows us to see each other through screens, as indeed we're seeing you now. Do you think that the experience of a Soviet immigrant may have been fundamentally different if Zoom had allowed you, the immigrant, to connect with family back home after you left?
Very interesting question. Yes, I think absolutely, because one of the things we suffered in the Soviet Union from, in a way, both acute and chronic, is the absence of connections and connectivity, the sense of isolation, isolation from each other and from the world. So absolutely, I do think this is true, much as I guess I hesitate to generalize about the Soviet past. I've tried to make a career about not generalizing about it, but yes, I think honestly, this pandemic has, I think, in a sense, brought to mind many questions about living in Soviet quarantine and isolation, not due to epidemiological issues, but due to political and ideological issues.
Mm.
And in fact, I can tell you, I recently had a presentation about Bunin and Nabokov. And of course, this had very little to do with the pandemic, but people kept asking, has Nabokov experienced isolation? Has Bunin experienced quarantine? And there are ways of answering that question. I mean, remember, Nabokov said that every writer immigrates into his art and stays therein.
Mm. So here's an interesting question that's a follow-up. Do you think that the process of writing has changed your perceptions of the Soviet Union or of your Jewish identity? And as you spend more and more time in the US, does your perspective change or grow stronger?
It's very, very interesting. Well, I think fundamentally, I don't think anything has changed my perspective on the Soviet Union, and particularly because it is colored, darkly animated by the experience, not just of being Jewish there, but of being refuseniks. But the writing about it, particularly in English, because some of the stories, autobiographical stories, writing in the memoir vein that I have done, were originally written in English and then co-translated into Russian. I think the experience of narrativizing it, of telling it in the form not just of a recollection, but a kind of story that tries to capture what's in the air of time, culture, and history. I think it has made me rethink certain things. I can tell you one anecdote, for instance. When I was working on Leaving Russia, I have a chapter there about the experience of being a young boy, the only Jewish boy in my class in my Soviet school. And one of the things that happened for various fatidic reasons is that at the time, after probably 2 decades of not being in touch with any of the former classmates, I reconnected with several of them. And what I decided to do is that I wrote to a number of them via email, telling them I was working on this book and that these were difficult things to grapple with. And I wanted to see the reaction. And some never wrote back after that. Several really were actively engaging, but in denial of the whole experience. Really, I think the only former classmate of mine who was entirely on the same page was a woman who was whose father was an ethnic Armenian. And I think Jews and Armenians just have this shared sense of the genocide, of basically communities on the brink of extinction. But so through communicating with these classmates, I really felt that the story altered itself, because one of the things I empirically realized that I could write about it and turn blue, trying to convince the world that prejudice was, in a sense, alive among young children in the way that's particularly hurting. The experience of post-Soviet Russia is very much one of denial rather than acceptance. And so in that chapter, I added a whole layer of sort of reflection, not just recollection, where I told this whole story and how what's particularly remarkable is that I can't seem to shed the burden of this, but other people have moved on.
Well, it raises one of the other questions that one of our audience members is asking, which is what kind of historical research do you do for your books? Do you interview family members? I guess you reach out to classmates.
Interesting. So basically, you know, I write 2 kinds of books broadly, and I really try to keep these sort of paths very separate. I do scholarship where, you know, I spent a lot of time in archives. Like right now I'm writing a piece about the 1943 Krasnodar trial, the first trial of Nazi accomplices held on Soviet territory. It's very, very interesting piece. So this is based on several years of research in archives, and it's all based on facts, discoveries. My literary books, however, are largely products of memory and imagination, and I do very little research per se. With Waiting for America, it was entirely an experience of reconstruction. With Leaving Russia, of course, I was very fortunate to rely on some materials in my parents' archive. I also in the anecdote I shared, simply had to face the experience of the story that continues to write itself, whether I like it or not. But generally speaking, in the memoirs I've written, my take has always been, I write about things I've experienced. Which is why, for instance, when I write about some of the hardest experiences of my parents' persecution as refuseniks activists, I make it very clear that there are certain things I will never know because my parents have shielded and protected me, and I cannot write about them. I can only give the sense of where I was, where these things were happening.
Well, that probably answers this other question, which is, have you ever given much thought or written about the post-Soviet Russian or even post-90s Russian immigrant experience, which can be quite different in many ways, but also somewhat similar to the protagonists you've described?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think it's quite impossible to live in our communities, particularly in larger American cities where the texture of everyday life is almost unimaginable without the presence of immigrants from the former Soviet Union, many of whom, of course, came in the 1990s and 2000s. It's quite impossible not to sort of conduct this odd artificial separation. There are, of course, differences that separate us. And I'm going to say something that I think is not going to sit well with some people. It's the same idea that, Solzhenitsyn used to say that if you're not a Zek, you will really not appreciate the experience of the Gulag. And some people really thought that was very cruel, but I think there is a certain existential truth to that. So I do think that the experience of having been refuseniks is one that probably brands you for life with a particular perspective. And that probably cannot just be are disposed of, because refuseniks challenged the Soviet system in large numbers. They returned the ticket to Soviet paradise, returned and returned and returned at the price of personal disasters, destruction of careers, the detriment to their children and family members. That was really a large community, much larger than any community of dissidents in the former Soviet Union.
So given that heavy imprint of being a refusenik, is it possible to ever fully assimilate? Or, the audience member asked, will we always have a bit of our immigrant selves who surface, especially during times of joy, crisis, or stress?
I think absolutely. And nor would I ever, preach the gospel of assimilation. I think acculturation is a different thing. I think one can be very, very, very completely acculturated, but to me, assimilation means something else, quite something else. Absolutely. And look, I've lived in this country for almost 34 years. That's almost 15 years longer than I had in Russia. And certainly my children were born here. My wife is American born. Parents were immigrants, but my sort of all the coordinates of my life are here. We don't even have family left in Soviet Union. I visit the graves once a year in Leningrad, in St. Petersburg, at the Preobrazhenskoye Jewish Cemetery. I'm the only family member that visits the graves. And I don't say this with pride. It's the fact. But there isn't a day when I don't think of my Russianness and of my being an immigrant.
And do you wonder what your life would have been like if you had stayed in Russia?
Yes, I actually have, and sort of in speculative ways, I've sort of woven these kind of threads into a few things I've written. I also I wrote a little book, which came out, I think, 4 years ago, about the present state of the Jewish community in Russia, called With or Without You, and which was based on a targeted visit, research, interviews, but it has a section where I describe sort of going around Moscow with my older daughter, Mira, who is now 14, but she was then a preteen, and showing her certain things. She had been to Moscow before, but particularly trying to explain to her that perhaps I would have been this person, or perhaps, my life would have been here.
Mhm. Mhm.
Not me, but, another person, not her dad.
So here's an interesting question. What do you think might be the difference between forced isolation, like we're experiencing now, and chosen isolation? For example, Thoreau's Time in the Woods for a writer. Is it harder or easier to be a
It's
productive?
an excellent question. Really, really excellent. And I think also it ties in with the idea of sort of the emigres, particularly of the first wave, who experienced isolation even before they emigrated. Think, for instance, of all these Russians in Crimea who were living already, in a sense, in a kind of isolation before they sailed across the Black Sea to Greece and Turkey and formally became immigrants. So I think the whether it's by choice or due to powers of history, there is still something different at stake here, because I think death is really knocking at our doors. And to me, this is just an experience that is in a league of its own. So I would honestly hesitate. I was just rereading actually Thoreau's book about Cape Cod, which is really wonderful and particularly touching in places, sort of this journey of self-isolation. But I just cannot imagine this aesthetically comparing to what we're going through now. In a sense, it's beyond aesthetics, which is why I find it so strange that some people have been writing so prolifically.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So another question here. As an immigrant and a scholar writing on immigration, you're in a funny place when you observe others in their natural setting. The very fact that you're present means that the setting is no longer their natural setting. Don't you think that what people say and do in your presence, therefore, may be different from what they would normally say or do?
It's a very kind of deconstructionist question, right? I really don't know. Yes, I think, yes, fundamentally, I think it's true. Well, I mean, I guess the question also goes back to the question asked one question ago, sort of about the limits of assimilation and acculturation, because in a sense, I do think that we grow different immigrant selves, but I don't think we shed our old selves. I still think in some ways, and I feel this, for instance, when I now communicate on a weekly basis with my two closest friends who stayed in Russia. I honestly feel like it's exactly where we used to be, when we met as 9 and 10-year-olds in some sense. But it's the only way to answer this question is with empirical data. But the question is how to collect it. I have no idea. Because every time you would interview people, there would be a bias.
This is the anthropologist's puzzle, isn't it? Right?
Exactly.
So we have time for one last question, and I think it's a good one to close on, which is, what experiences do you find the most difficult to write, or the easiest, or the most joyful?
Yeah. Well, I think the most difficult experiences for me to have written about have been the experiences of prejudice and intolerance, but not in some sort of general humanistic way, but in the experienced way in which I experienced it, and I think many ex-Soviets and many ex-Soviet Jews experienced. I think I personally have found, different people feel different, that writing about them does not cure you of the trauma. I think it simply cures you over need to tell the story, but I think the trauma remains. Joyful. Honestly, I can tell you, when I was writing Waiting for America, we were expecting our first child. I was in a hurry to finish the book because I felt like, it's time to provide for my heirs and all of that. And there was a chapter I was writing, which is about my late grandmother who came with us and who lived till 95 in America, how we were in San Marino and she got separated from us and she basically went on a live broadcast on the public little local public station in San Marino and sort of told her life. And I remember I was writing about it and I called my mother, who is a translator and a wonderful reader with a perfect pitch. And I said, Mom, I'm laughing as I'm writing this. So I think something about family happiness for me is a source of particular joy.
Oh, thank you so much, Maxime, for ending on that note, that positive note that we can hold on to in these difficult times. And thank you for sharing your ideas, your book, your wisdom with us. We very much appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. And thank you to all of you listeners. See you again. See you soon. Stay well.